From San Francisco, it's Grumpy Old Doc with Dr. Gene Bede.
Hi, this is Dr. Gene Bede, and welcome to the Grumpy Old Doc. There are a few things that make me as grumpy as that combination of bad medicine and unscrupulous business practices. And unfortunately, we see such combinations of bad behavior repeatedly in healthcare today. And the one that comes to mind that we're going to talk a little bit about today is purple crack. So what am I talking about when I say purple crack? I'm talking about a group of drugs called the proton pump inhibitors. And Prilosec, Nexium, Prevacid, and many other brands are examples of this category of drugs. And for the purposes of today's discussion, they're all pretty much interchangeable. Why do I call them purple crack? Because people can't get off this stuff. One of the things that these drugs do is when you take them for heartburn, your heartburn gets a lot worse once you stop taking them for heartburn. So I call them purple crack, and I call them purple crack because a couple of these major pills made their color their marketing piece that would get you to remember them. I remember years ago, here in the BART tunnel, all of the display advertising that they had up was taken down and replaced with just a purple field of color with the tiny logo of a drug company in the bottom. Then, a few weeks later, we had these capsules falling out of the sky like meteors, purple on a purple background, with a tiny little drug company logo in the corner. Eventually, the name and the indication of the drug were made public as part of this marketing campaign, but it was clearly an image advertising campaign direct to the consumer to get them to ask for the purple pill. And that's been a highly successful task to get people to ask for the purple pill. The purple pill sold somewhere around $10 billion worth of pills last year, over 100 million prescriptions. It's getting eroded a little bit because you can buy the purple pill over the counter and do to yourself what your doctor used to do to you. Why am I down on the purple pill? Well, first of all, let me tell you why people have been up on the purple pill. The stuff works really well. It works well on heartburn, magically on ulcers and erosions of your esophagus. All drugs are evaluated on their ability to be effective and on their safety. Unfortunately, with a lot of drugs, the effectiveness is apparent right away up front when you see how it helps people. The issues with safety sometimes are a little harder to discern and come a little bit after the fact. So doctors love proton pump inhibitors because they really work. And you can assure yourself that once you give these things to a patient, they're probably not going to have any more heartburn. They're probably not going to have any bleeding. The drug companies really aggressively promoted these drugs as well as a class because they're highly profitable. These are drugs that they were able to really grow the market for. Why did they grow the market for them? Well, the incidence of heartburn, otherwise now known as gastroesophageal reflux, has been steadily increasing over the last decade, maybe 5% a year. Right now, about 1 out of every 5 Americans say they suffer from heartburn or GE reflux. This is also correlated with the increase in America's obesity rate. It's not a coincidence. Some of the reason people get heartburn is their anatomy gets distorted by the fact that they're carrying around too much weight, and it starts to push the contents of the stomach out. Sort of just the opposite of Joey Chestnut, where apparently nothing pushes anything out of his stomach going back up. But you gain a little bit of weight, it changes the angles, and it increases the amount of heartburn. And this is a very effective drug for heartburn. It's also a very, very difficult drug to get off. But nevertheless, the drug companies did an outstanding job of promoting this drug on a number of fronts. One, it just promoted itself for its efficacy against heartburn. Number two, they promoted it aggressively as reducing the incidence of certain kinds of cancer of the esophagus caused by chronic reflux. And the idea was, well, if you don't give one of these to your patients and they get a Barrett's esophagus or a cancer of the esophagus, you're going to be in trouble from a risk perspective. And to give you an idea of the extent of the marketing efforts of the drug companies for these class of drugs, they even went so far as to market a product that bundled a naproxen tablet, an Aleve tablet for those of you that buy things over the counter, with a purple crack pill. The idea is that NSAIDs, Aleve, Motrin, aspirin, all cause an increased risk of gastric bleeding. And ostensibly, by taking a purple pill along with this, you could negate that risk. But these pills are not without risks themselves, as we are gradually seeing. It's been known for some time they reduce the stomach acid. So what does that do? Well, they reduce it so well that the body upregulates everything that is involved with stomach acid. And we don't even know what some of these effects are because they're hormonal. But what we do know is that once you try to get off this medicine, the body has upregulated acid production so much that whatever your problem was before being on the medicine is likely to be made dramatically worse if you suddenly stop this medicine. So it's tough to get off of this medicine. There are other problems with the medicine. Like all medicines, it has interactions with other drugs. In this case, things like Valium and Dilantin and Coumadin, drugs that are used for anti-clotting. And some of those interactions can be pretty serious. One of the big issues with this class of drugs is that without any stomach acid, you're going to have trouble absorbing certain minerals like magnesium and calcium. The long-term effects of that are very, very troubling. It seems like people develop more osteoporosis and more fractures when they're on this drug. A really troubling study that came out from about a year ago from Germany seemed to indicate that more people on this class of drugs develop dementia, Alzheimer's disease, than those who don't. That's very troubling, and it started people really, really looking at this whole class of drugs. One of the worst infections you can get in a nursing home or as an elderly debilitated person is diarrhea from something called C. diff, Clostridium difficile. Your risks of getting that are increased by taking this group of drugs. And perhaps most troubling this last week was a study that came out in the British medical journal Open saying that when they looked at VA patients in St. Louis, they discovered that taking a PPI increased your chance of death by 25%. What that means is with these 110 million prescriptions out there, 1 out of every 500 of those people are going to be killed by one of these drugs. Where did this study come from? It came from St. Louis. What other companies do we know of that are based in? Well, there's the big PBM, Express Scripts. And what do they do for a living? They make sure that drugs are being used appropriately by their customers across the board. Nevertheless, there's been studies going back for years that seem to show that 75, 80% of the prescriptions for this class of drugs are unnecessary. They're not supported by the clinical need. They aren't for people who have Barrett's esophagus or at risk for cancer of esophagus. They're not at people who are recurrently bleeding. They're not at people in the process of healing an erosion or an ulcer. They're people who may have had an erosion or ulcer in the distant past, or they're often people who are given this who've never had a bleed to keep them from ever bleeding. And then there's people who get it simply because they have heartburn, and instead of trying other measures first, they go right to the purple crack. So 75% of a market that is $10 billion in size and killing 1 out of every 500 people that take the drug, not to mention the fractures, the dementia, the C. diff diarrhea, and the other stuff that we don't even know about because we haven't defined it yet. Why aren't our guardians of appropriate drug use doing anything when their cohorts in public health right across the river study the same problem and come up with a stunning answer out of the data? Well, I think this is another classic example of how PBMs rip you off. And they not only rip you off, but they kill you in the process of ripping you off. The more PPI prescriptions that are sold, And the more dollars that were spent for them, the more money the PBMs made in terms of rebates. And because all of these products competed against each other, and they weren't that different based on their clinical characteristics, the PBMs could play these products against each other. These were the classic products that got switched at your doctor's office or pharmacy, because they're all basically the same for most people. So this is a PBM dream. So what do? They make sure that, first of all, they don't care about the price because they'll get back in rebates what they lose. They care about unit volume. So years ago, pharmacy benefit managers put into place persistency programs. What are those? Well, they're programs that sound really good to make sure to remind you to take your medicine. And for certain drugs, it's really, really important. Fosamax, the drugs that are called bisphosphonates that are used for osteoporosis. If you miss 1 out of 5 doses of those drugs, they have no effect at all. You'll still get the side effects, but you won't get any beneficial effects. So the idea of a persistency program makes a lot of sense for certain conditions, not for symptomatic ones. I don't need a persistency program to tell me to take Tylenol for a headache. I don't need a persistency program to tell me to put an ointment on an itchy rash. And I certainly don't need a persistency program to tell me to take purple crack when I have a little bit of heartburn. And yet that's exactly the behavior that the PBMs engaged in. Persistency programs for the purple crack, reminder programs, automatic refill programs, patient education programs, phone calls to get the percentage of people who refill their medicine month in, month out, jack it up there, get the unit volume up there so they can get more and more rebates. And not only more and more rebates, folks, this is a hidden, non-transparent source of income for the PBMs. They get paid on the barrelhead by the drug companies for these persistency programs. So for the drug companies, increased volume. For the PBM, increased volume, which equals increased rebate. And also extra money that does not have to be considered as a rebate that's paid directly to them in terms of persistency programs. This despite the evidence from the recent study in St. Louis in the VA that the longer you are on these drugs, the worse off you are, that your risk of death goes up for every month that you are on these drugs. So one has to ask, are the PBMs acting in the interest of their patients, or have they indeed violated the basic maxim of do no harm? I think it's pretty obvious which way these folks are going. Isn't it sad, too, that this research that takes place in the same town as Express Scripts lives in has to be published in a British medical journal? And once again, if we're going to look for guidelines, for recipes, for ways doctors should help patients get off of these drugs, do we find them somewhere in the United States? Are they being put out by Express Scripts or our good friends at the other PBMs? Heck no. Where are they coming from? They're coming from Canada. Why are they coming from Canada? Because Canada knows darn well how many billions of dollars their health service spends directly on these drugs. And when they take a look at their data, they know darn well what percentage of these drugs are not needed at all. Perhaps some of the more recent information indicating the safety problems of these drugs are also giving the boot up in Canada. But the bottom line is this is an economic nightmare. Overprescribing of a drug that's expensive, the drug companies pushing it aggressively, the PBMs are all lined up. The doctors like the stuff. They see the efficacy and they don't see the downside. But they should, and they should be aware that it's there. And if you're a doctor, you need to look at all of your patients on these drugs and come up with a personalized plan to see whether each and every one of them needs this drug, and if they don't, that you work together to get them off of it. And if you're a patient that's on this drug, you should understand, your doctor should be able to explain to you, hey, you got a Barrett's esophagus. Hey, you're chronically on drugs that really increase your risk of bleeding. Hey, you have severe esophagitis. Hey, you have bleeding ulcers and you get them repeatedly. Or we've tried to take you off this drug and it simply hasn't worked. But if all you have is heartburn, or you had an erosion or an ulcer who's been healed, or you were put it on this drug when you were in the hospital and kept on it to keep you from having an ulcer.